In this video, I'll discuss the Learn Your Lines and Do the Right Thing activities. For the Learn Your Lines activity, you are looking for different pieces of equipment in the lab and trying to consider what they might be used for. Down below, I've already filled in a key for the different sorts of equipment. I'm going to spend some time talking about what each of these pieces of equipment is used for. The beaker is a small piece of glassware that is used for containing larger scale reactions or holding relatively large amounts of liquid. You don't use the beaker to measure volumes of liquid, despite the fact that it has measurements on the side. You use the graduated cylinder to measure the volume of liquids. The clay triangle will sit on an iron ring, which is attached to a ring stand. The purpose of the clay triangle is to hold a crucible. This lets the crucible be heated very directly so that it can get extremely hot. The test tube is used for similar situations as the beaker is, except this is for small scale reactions and for containing small amounts of liquid. Both of these are sort of reaction chambers that we will use in chemistry. The evaporating dish we use to try and isolate a solid that has been dissolved in a liquid. So what happens with this is we'll heat the evaporating dish on a Bunsen burner. The evaporating dish will have a solution, for example, salt water. Salt water is a mixture of salt and water where the salt has been dissolved, and then if you boil it in an evaporating dish, the water will evaporate away, but the salt will be left behind. And that's the purpose of the evaporating dish, is to try and get some solid that has been dissolved in a liquid by boiling away that liquid. The graduated cylinder we use to measure the volumes of liquids. So again, we use the graduated cylinder and not the beaker when we want to measure volumes of liquids. The funnel we use primarily for filtration. You put a little piece of filter paper in the top of the funnel, and that then you will dump a solution through it, and any solid particles that are in that liquid will be filtered out, similar to how a coffee filter works. The crucible tongues we use to pick up a large variety of pieces of equipment in the lab. We might use it to pick up a crucible, but also wire gauze, or a watch glass, or some small piece of glassware, even some small beakers. It might be more convenient to pick up using crucible tongs. So sometimes I joke that we should call them everything tongs. The watch glass is sort of like a little lid that you'll put on top of evaporating dishes or beakers when you don't want something to splash out or boil over. It's made of clear glass, so you can see right through it, which is why it's called a watch glass. Additionally, you need to make sure to put it curvy side down so that it doesn't slip off of whatever container it's in. The Erlenmeyer flask is sort of similar to the beaker, except we use it when we want a closed container for a reaction. It has a little stopper that fits in the top of the flask, and that will close the reaction off to the outside environment. Sometimes we'll put a tube in the stopper to try and vent some gas from a chemical reaction. A crucible is a small ceramic cup that we use to heat a substance very intensely. This is when you want to remove any moisture that might be inside of a substance. Usually what this is we will put a solid inside of the crucible, and then you'll heat it really intensely on the Bunsen burner, and all of that liquid that was mixed in with the solid would be removed. For instance, you could put wet sand inside of a crucible and heat it very, very intensely, and eventually all of that water would be driven out. Beaker tongs are pretty self-explanatory. We use them to lift up beakers. If you're ever picking up a beaker, you need to make sure that the tongs are right along the lip at the top of the beaker so that it doesn't slip. Sometimes if you grab too low on the beaker, it will slip down and the lip will break off and the beaker will fall through. The Bunsen burner is what we use to get a flame in the lab. You attach it to a gas valve, you use a match to light it, and fire comes from the Bunsen burner. A test tube holder, as the name indicates, holds a test tube. We use that if we need to hold a test tube over the Bunsen burner for a short amount of time. If you need to use a test tube under a Bunsen burner for a long period of time, you're going to use the utility clamp. The utility clamp attaches to the ring stand, so it can just sit there and hold a test tube without you having to hold it yourself for a long period of time. And so we would use the test tube holder if we want to heat it for a short time, and the utility clamp if we want to heat a test tube for a long period of time. The pipette is used to move small amounts of liquid from place to place. So you will suck the liquid up into the pipette and then use it to drop little bits of that liquid out somewhere else. The test tube brush is used to clean test tubes. However, make sure that you're not being too forceful, because a lot of people will end up pushing the brush all the way through the bottom end of the test tube and end up breaking it. The wash bottle contains distilled water. We use this if we need small amounts of distilled water for a reaction, and also sometimes we'll use the distilled water to rinse a container if we are trying to dump something out of it that is sticking to the sides of the container. The ring stand is used as a platform for the Bunsen burner, and also we can put various things on that ring stand, most notably the utility clamp and the iron ring. The utility clamp and the iron ring help hold items above the Bunsen burner. Wire gauze is used to help stabilize items that are placed on the iron ring. So if you need to put a beaker above a Bunsen burner, oftentimes what you'll do is you will attach an iron ring to the ring stand, and then you will place the wire gauze on top of the iron ring, and then place the beaker on top of the wire gauze. What this does is makes it more difficult for the beaker to slip. Sometimes, especially if we're talking about a small beaker, it can fall inside the gap in the iron ring, and it can fall through or splash, or something can break. The wire gauze just keeps everything stable. And finally, the test tube rack is used if we're going to be doing multiple reactions in many different test tubes at once. It just helps to organize the test tubes if we have a lot of different reactions going on. There are two other pieces of equipment that I want to make sure that you're familiar with. One of them is the glass stirring rod. It's just like it sounds. It's a sort of long piece of glass about the length of a straw that you would drink out of, and you use it to stir things in the lab. And the other one is a pinch clamp. We use a pinch clamp to fasten off a piece of rubber tubing. What you do is you pinch the clamp and you put the rubber tubing in between the pieces of metal at the end. It works kind of like a spring. It pinches down on the rubber tubing and closes it off so that no gas or liquid can pass through. Now I'll go on to talk about the second part of the worksheet. This presents a series of safety situations where you have to think what you would do in the lab if this happened to you. The first one says, Anne opens the vents on her goggles because the weather is warm and her face is hot. So for this one, generally speaking, you should never open the vents on your goggles. Some people have a rule that you would open them in some cases and not open them in other cases, and I just don't want you all to be responsible for remembering when it's okay to open them and when it's not. It will usually not be okay to open them anyway. And so if you enter a situation where your face is hot and uncomfortable and you want to get some relief, ask me if you can go step out in the hallway, and then you can remove your goggles safely in the hallway and come back in when you're ready. The second one says, when Bart accidentally dropped a beaker, it broke into fairly large pieces, so he picked up the broken glass with his hands and put it in the broken glass bucket. So in this case, you should just never pick up broken glass with your hand. If anything breaks, it's not going to be so large that you can't use the broom and dustpan for it. So just sweep that broken glass into a dustpan and then put it into the broken glass bucket. Don't use your hands. C says, Carol lit the Bunsen burner with a match and then blew it out. blew out the match and set it on the shelf above the lab bench. There's a designated place for matches to go once they're out. They go into the match cans that are on the centers of the lab tables. You don't want to put them anywhere else because you risk starting something on fire. Specifically, don't put them in the garbage can. A lot of times I hear news stories about schools where there's been a fire that started because somebody has thrown a match in a garbage can, and I just don't want that to happen at West High School. D says, Derek spooned out too much reactant on the scale, so he just put the extra back into the stock bottle. In this case, the problem is that you might contaminate the stock bottle. So if you spoon extra out, sometimes I'll tell you that you can just use the extra in your experiment and just take note of the fact that you used extra. Sometimes I'll tell you to dispose of the extra as waste. This might go down the sink or it might go into a waste beaker. Just ask me if you're confused about where that should go, but don't put it back into the stock bottle. That would contaminate it. E says, when Elaine finished using a 250 milliliter beaker, she rinsed it out and put it back on the shelf. The only problem here is that she should have dried the beaker before putting it away. We want to make sure that the glassware is dry so that the next person who comes to use it doesn't have to deal with it being wet, especially since sometimes we'll put solid substances into the glassware, and you don't want that to end up mixing with some water that's left over from the last person. Additionally, it can cause issues with mold and stuff like that if too much wet glassware is put away. F says, after the evaporating dish has been over the Bunsen burner, Frank knew it was too hot to touch. He used the tongs to put the hot dish under cold tap water. The problem here is if you take something that's really hot and you put it under cold water, that thing is probably going to break. This happens because part of the glass or ceramic is going to try and condense really quickly and not uniformly, and so it ends up shattering whatever piece of equipment you have. And so if you're going to try and cool something down, you just got to be patient and wait until it's so cool that you can hold it comfortably in your hand, and at that point you can put it under water and clean it and things like that. So unfortunately, a lot of times it's just patience in terms of waiting for things to cool down on their own. G says Gail's lab partner had collected the equipment at the beginning of the lab, so she wasn't sure where to put some of it away. Gail placed the flask on the shelf by the water bottles. This happens a lot. Students don't know where to put things. Make sure that if you don't know where something goes, that you ask somebody else, or you can just simply look around the lab and figure out where that goes, because there's probably a lot of those pieces of equipment stored somewhere, and you just can find them and put the thing that you have with the other things that are like it. H says, Hector remembered to wash his hands after the lab, but when he picked up a paper towel, another one fell into the sink. He figured he should just leave it there since his hands were already clean. The next student would probably throw it away. So in this case, it's just someone, maybe they have good intentions. Maybe they really just think that it's more convenient for somebody to take care of it. But as a rule of thumb, we're going to say that you need to take responsibility for your own messes, and if something happens in the lab, you take care of it rather than leaving it on somebody else. So he should have just picked up the paper towel for himself, washed his hands again. It would have taken like 30 seconds, which is not the worst thing in the world. It's maybe not the most pleasant thing, but I think that anybody could make it through 30 seconds. I says, when working with acid in the lab, Isabella spilled some acid on her arm. She immediately went to the teacher to inform her of the accident. So this is a big deal because a lot of times something will go wrong, and people will spend time looking for me to ask me what to do. Generally speaking, if it's a true emergency, I want you to try and deal with it yourself immediately and either send someone to get me or yell my name and I'll come over. But don't go around looking for me before you deal with an accident. Also, if you get acid on your arm, you probably want to put it in the sink and run it under water. If you spilled acid on your body, on the larger, like a larger chunk of your body that would not conveniently fit into the sink, then you would use the chemical shower to shower off. Jay says, Jason used the last match in the matchbook. He put the match and the matchbook in the metal can above the lab bench. In this case, the only problem is that the matchbooks themselves are flammable, and so if you put them in the match can, they risk starting a little fire in the match can. It's better if you only put matches in the match can and throw the matchbooks away in the garbage if they are empty. Kay says it was difficult to get all of the reactant into a test tube, and several folks spilled some on the lab bench by the scales. At the end of the lab, the lazy students washed their hands and went back to the classroom. There are a lot of labs where you'll be measuring out a solid, and almost every time if I go and I look by the mass balances, I see that there's a lot of solids spilled around. If that's the case, what I want you to do, probably the people who finish up the lab earlier than the others, that would be a good choice. I want people to wipe down the tables around there and clean up the mess. Don't just leave it for me to clean at the end of the day or the end of the period. And then the last one here says, while using a Bunsen burner, Kami got too close and her clothes caught on fire. Her lab partner grabbed the fire extinguisher, sprayed her with it to put the fire out. The problem here is that when a person is on fire, you don't use the fire extinguisher, you use a fire blanket. The reason is that the fire extinguisher is meant to cut off oxygen to a fire so that it doesn't have any more fuel to burn, and if you do the same thing and spray it at a person, then you are removing the breathable oxygen for that person. It would either make it really hard for them to breathe, or you might even end up asphyxiating them and causing them to cease to be able to breathe and then die. And so it's pretty dangerous to spray somebody with a fire extinguisher. Use the fire blanket on a person. Use the fire extinguisher if you've got a fire that is not a person. If you're confused about any of these safety situations, or if you have any other situations that you want to know how to deal with, make sure that you come in and talk with me. I want to make sure that you feel well prepared for anything that might happen in the lab.